On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
Jewish denominations are the future. Jewish denominations will destroy us all. For thousands of years, Jews have organized themselves into all sorts of groupings, and today we solve all of what ails Jewish denominations once and for all. I'm your host, Avi Feingold, born and raised in Montreal, a city of many delights, and I'm joined by Yedida Eisenstadt, hailing from the wilds of Toronto. She is the associate editor of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture, and Matthew Leibel, rabbi and spiritual director at Winnipeg's Simkin Center. We are not in heaven. Matthew, Yedida, how you guys been?
Fantastic.
Good, thanks.
Anything interesting? Have you been to Jamaica this weekend?
I was not in Jamaica this weekend.
Wow, that was a bit of a humble brag there.
Yeah, I know.
Since we last spoke, I turned 40, bought a new house, and had a little vacation without my children. So I am flying high.
Wait, everybody's talking about how I went to Jamaica for the weekend. You totally won this weekend. I don't care what anybody says about me going to Jamaica for doing a wedding.
I've been saving
awesome.
It was it's been a pretty wild week since we last were together on Not in Heaven, and I've tried to jam as much in as possible. I'm tired.
Okay, let's start with a spin around the Jewish world. Have you seen this thing about the highest minyan in the world that was done in Nepal, where Charlie Tayeb assembled a minyan to show solidarity with the hostages on October 7th? And then it became like this TikTok sensation for the past few days.
Voilà. Comme nous l'avons dit, nous voulons faire le plus haut Kaddish du monde de toutes les victimes du 7 octobre.
Allez, c'est ce répertoire que je veux faire pour mes parents et ma sœur.
L'ifne bene Israël, Adi Adonai ve'ad Moshe, Adi Adonai ve'ad Moshe, Torah temet natan lanu.
I don't know how to describe it. They're like, we're going to honor the people that were captured, that were hostages, and we're going to climb a mountain, and we're going to do a minyan as high as we possibly can. I was kind of like weirdly, like bizarrely, like something about it. Like, I don't know. Should this really be a thing? Do we need minions that break records? I'm like, why would you? Because they talk about how they got sick. They usually spend 5 minutes up there, but they spent like 45 minutes up there doing a minion. And I'm like, why would you get sick to like honor somebody's life by like being at a minion 5,000, 50,000 feet up in the air, whatever it was?
Yeah, that was kind of my reaction too, Avi. I applaud them, and the motivation is very inspiring. The story is very cool, but these are the sorts of events that I like to watch from as far away as possible and just kind of wonder what they're doing. I also will admit that I was a little thrown when I read the headline, the highest minyan possible, and that it wasn't at a Fish concert or something like that. Like,
or in Jamaica.
Sure. Yeah, or another chance to bring up the fact that you were in Jamaica.
Like, have we not learned the lesson about from the Tower of Babel that it's not about how high you can go to reach God, and that like that's not the goal of the minyan, is to like be physically like, oh, we're going to do this by going as high as we possibly can? No, it's okay. You can pray wherever you want, and God will listen to you, and that's fine.
I think that's true. And it's funny, it's not our wisdom for the week on the Parsha, but there is a teaching out of this week's Parsha about the fact that Sinai was chosen for the giving of the Torah because it wasn't the tallest mountain in the world, because it was a mountain, but it was still a more humble mountain. This idea that like, what are you trying to get so high for? I kind of like that take, Avi.
Totally. Moving on to Cambridge, England, where Professor Aaron Kohler will join the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies in September of 2025 as the newly appointed Regius Professor of Hebrew. He is the first Jew to be appointed to this position in hundreds of years, since this position has been established by King Henry VIII in 1540. Yedida, as our resident academic correspondent, can you explain to us why this is noteworthy?
I think it's like a nice development. Aaron Kohler, Professor, Regius Professor, soon to be Professor Aaron Kohler, is an excellent scholar, and it's a recognition of his excellence as a scholar. I mean, Hebrew's been studied there as an ancient language, with Latin, with Greek as part of our heritage and study of the ancient world. And I think it's a positive development for a knowledgeable Jew to be part of that conversation, showing how ancient Judaism interacted with the pagan religions of Greece and Rome, and then also in the development of Christianity.
In 580 years or something, it was like 1540 that Henry VIII established this position, this Regius Professor position, and never once has there been a Jewish...
I'm not that surprised.
Surprised? Nothing surprises me anymore, but...
as he said in the JTA article, he's not going there for Jewish studies to be for Jews, and it's part of a larger conversation, and it recognizes, I think, the placement of the study of ancient Judaism in the Hebrew Bible in the ancient context as part of the ancient world.
I remember, this is not a Bible thing, but this is very, very similar, that I always say that I had one quarter at the University of Chicago where I learned more about Talmud than I learned in years and years of yeshiva from this professor. And one of those weeks, he was sitting there eating a sandwich, and it was Chol Hamoed Pesach. And I'm like, oh, that's okay. He's super secular, but he really knows his stuff more than anybody else that I'd ever, I had insights from him. I was like, okay, this is what it means to learn these days, is you take the truth and you learn it from wherever it is that you're going to come from.
Yeah, no, I've definitely had moments like that. When I was studying biblical Hebrew at Hebrew U, a bunch of evangelical kids who were studying biblical Hebrew in my class also taught me all kinds of things and tricks that I, otherwise maybe never would have picked up. Yeah, they helped me do really well in that class.
The fact that I always love is until recently, and relatively recently, I mean until 100 years ago or so, but for a couple of 100 years at Harvard, all of the commencement addresses, one of the acceptable languages was Biblical Hebrew as one of the classical languages.
I did not know that.
Neither did I. That's wild.
I think that there are more non-Jews studying Hebrew Bible at any point in time ever in history than any Jews have ever been doing this.
Probably that's a fair statement, but I also think that Jews don't really have a good grasp or don't care about the whole history of Christians studying Jews and Judaism and Jewish languages. So, from the 12th, 13th century, there's a move that Christians are starting to read rabbinic texts and gain access to Hebrew texts, initially in contact with Jews. But once they can do it by themselves, they're off to the races.
I suspect that they waited this long because Professor Kohler had to grow an epically large professorial beard and hair. And before that, he did not have this. If you look at the earlier pictures when he was at Yeshiva University, he's all prim and proper and very Yeshiva University-esque. And now he's like, oh, yes, you belong in Cambridge.
My husband and I refer to people with big beards like that in the academy sometimes. Bible people as Ashurbanipal, an ancient Babylonian king, the etchings of whom have a big ancient Near Eastern, ancient beard.
So if I called it a ZZ Top beard, that would not be a reference that would grab you, would it, Yedida?
Call it a Zion
not
top?
As much.
When I was on the radio, there was a guy, we were giving away tickets to a ZZ Top reunion band, and he insisted on calling them ZZ Top. That doesn't work, pal.
I love it.
It just doesn't work.
Let's move on to our big story of the week. A couple weeks ago, a story broke by the Canadian Jewish News about Dorshei Emet, which is the Reconstructionist congregation in Montreal. I happen to know the rabbi. That's my full disclosure. I know many of the members of the congregation. They had a vote recently whether or not they should separate themselves from the Reconstructionist movement, or as it's called nowadays, Reconstructing Judaism. That is their official title. And the vote did not go in that direction, meaning they are still a member of the Reconstructionist community, but it seemed very divisive because 40% of the membership that did go out to vote was in favor of divesting from the Reconstructionist movement, specifically because of their current stance, or what was perceived as their current stance on Israel and Zionism, and that they saw that as unacceptable. Now, the questions that come to mind is, first of all, how different Canadian Judaism is, specifically when it comes to liberal denominations. And it really got us thinking about denominations in general and whether these questions that have been floating around in the air about it being a post-denominational world and that Judaism is really moving away from denominations is true, is not, what is the value of thinking about things denominationally or not. I'm going to throw to you, Dita. You live in the States now. You grew up in Canada in a more traditional environment. Do you think that the flavor of Canadian Jewry does affect like how Jews, actually work within denominations or within tradition?
Yes. I think there is something palpably different. I'm not going to say qualitatively different. I don't think it's a quality question. I think it's a sociology question. My sense, and it could just be like where my parents live and who I see and talk to when I'm in Toronto, but the Toronto modern Orthodox community is like in a different place in its modern Orthodoxy, as far as I can tell, than the modern congregations that I find myself in the States. And what do I mean by that? I mean that I think that a lot about Jewish denominations shows up on women's bodies. I think that the way that women dress and code themselves in Orthodox communities in Toronto is much, much, much more traditional than what I see in liberal Orthodox schools in the States. I wouldn't say that there are even any liberal Orthodox congregations in Canada. I don't think that that exists particularly. Avi, I guess maybe where you guys were in Montreal before?
Ish, but like the Shar Shemaim is probably an exception to the rule.
Right. They had a woman on the clergy staff. I don't think any other major Orthodox shul in Canada has had that yet. In fact,
or minor.
Right. So, and in Toronto, when I graduate in a few weeks, it may or may not be acknowledged. So the questions that sort of the left wing of Orthodoxy is dealing with in America are very different questions, I think, than Orthodoxy. I wouldn't even say it's a super left wing in Toronto. And even in the States, I don't feel like I have a great grasp on it, except that it feels more post-denominational to me. It feels like people are not in their practice quite as defined, or in their ideology as defined by the movement as I think people in Canada are more.
That reminded me of something. I remember going out to a cousin's bat mitzvah in California, probably early 2000s, somewhere between 20 and 25 years ago. And the things were happening at a conservative shul, and they had a keyboard player through the entire service. And I remember thinking, oh, that's weird. No conservative shul in Canada would have that. Like Shared Zedek, when I worked there, we brought keyboards in around shortly after that. We were still kind of technically calling ourselves a conservative shul, but they hadn't been involved with the movement, and then they kind of left the movement. But I remember thinking at the time, Canadian conservative shuls would never have a keyboard, and yet here we are in the States, and their conservative shul does have a keyboard. So I remember being confused about that, and there being this disconnect between what's conservative in Canada versus what's conservative in the United States.
Well, did Canadian conservative synagogues sort of secede from United Synagogue and open their own thing? So, in
the mid-2000 first decade, that's when my former shul, Shared Zedek, did that, yeah.
Yeah, but there still are deep ties with the conservative movement. They might have their own way of thinking about it. And yes, they are more traditional in general. But basically, to sum it up, the Canadian way is generally going to be a little bit more traditional. So Dorshei Emet, for example, in Montreal, it's a Reconstructionist congregation. They have a lot of the ideas from Mordecai Kaplan that is, governing them. They have a great Reconstructionist rabbi who is very, very committed to Reconstructionist principles. But at the end of the day, the population, you look at them and you look at the principles that they stand behind, they're kind of like conservative-ish in terms of how they practice their Judaism day to day.
So one thing that I was really struck by in reading the article was that Rabbi Dolan told the CJ, and I'm going to read the quote because I actually think it's a great quote that actually gets to the heart of the Reconstructionist reconstructing movement, where he said, we really shined as Reconstructionists when he's describing his process for, how the shul educated themselves and did this whole project before the vote. He says, we held meetings, voted, studied history and values, brought in speakers, and used a values-based approach to decide what's best for the community. And I really appreciated that as an articulation. And I think that also gets to the question of part of, I think, why denominations arguably are failing in the 21st century, which is to say that I don't think the average Jew on the street and maybe I'm not giving people enough credit, and I'll feel like a jerk, and you can tell me if I'm being a jerk, but I just don't think that people can like articulate the, core missions and what distinguishes the different denominations from each other and what the primary values are and what commitments are theoretically required of them by affiliating with the denomination. Because a lot of Judaism has moved away from this framework of obligation. And with that, there's lots of different value systems within Judaism. One of them is obligation. And I think we've moved away from that, and that's okay. There are other values, but let's articulate them and let's talk about how denominations should be convincing people, like, we are compelling, come join us.
What you're saying in terms of like obligation versus non-obligation, that's the part that I think is fascinating, and like the quote unquote failure of denominations in the 21st century. I think you're definitely right about how movements have not been able to articulate to people why they should join one movement or another. And I think that's because there has been a bit of a lack of focus within the denominations of like what makes one unique and what, separates them from each other. I want to start with you actually, Matthew, because you're the one that's actually practicing very much in what I would imagine you even see yourself as a post-denominational context.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
What was your impetus for saying, you know what, I don't want to identify with this movement, I don't want to identify with that movement? And how do you actually see what you do within the context of Judaism? Meaning, like, how do you decide I'm going to do this from this piece and that from that piece? Walk us through what it looks like day to day to be more post-denominational.
Part of it, I think, is part of it is like you're kind of evaluating as you go. You don't like to be drawing the lines as you're moving, but sometimes you have to be realistic that that's what's happening. First of all, I wanted to say that, Yudita, what you said, I think you're absolutely right, and you're not a jerk. I think if you grabbed the average person on the street and said, what kind of Jew are you from a denomination standpoint, I think they would get very upset because people don't like labels to begin with these days. And then I think they also would be like, I don't know the difference. I think it used to be, if you were a conservative Jew, at least in my world, it was because you went to a shul that called itself a conservative shul. If you were a Reformed Jew, it was because you went to the Reformed shul. If you were like, the shul determined what your identity was more than your practice. So for me, I would have thought for the longest time I was a conservative Jew because I went to a synagogue where I had my bar mitzvah, Shared Zedek, ended up working there for many years. That was a member of the conservative movement. But the irony there was that according to the definition of what makes a conservative Jew, I kept seeing that none of the people who went to that shul, either just on Yontif or regularly, really fit that bill. They were definitely more reform, or they were more secular, or they were more not that. And then to your question, Avi, about like, how do I practice? Well, it just kind of came down to a lot of like gut feelings, right? How do I feel about what we're doing? Like, have I ever taken a step back? Like, I knew very early on that I was egalitarian. I knew very on because when I was in Orthodox synagogues, I didn't like that men and women were sitting separately. I just knew where that hit me in my kishkas. So that was something that I was going to check. I was like, I definitely liked the way that they knew the Sidur and they knew the Torah and it was like there was a language and there was a flow and I admired all those things. But the mechitza, I was out. And then over time, as I got older and I met more people through my work and then became a rabbi myself, I think there are these big moments that come up. We talked last week, where do you stand on intermarriage? That's a big defining thing, I think, in terms of when you say I'm not a denominational rabbi. Like, if I was looking for a rabbi, I would have my list of questions, and the questions would be like, where do you stand on intermarriage? Where do you stand on cremation? Where do you stand on the prayer book? Where do you stand on services? Where do you and those are the things that I think I ask myself, or I've asked myself, and those answers determine what kind of rabbi I see myself as. Like, I didn't go through one of the movements. My smicha is from a very outside the box kind of situation. I consider myself an outside the box rabbi, but that doesn't answer anybody's question when they say what kind of rabbi you are. You have to say, I'm a rabbi who believes in this. I'm a rabbi who believes in this. And I think that's where I've kind of found myself.
I want to put you maybe a little bit on the spot.
I can take it.
I know. And so the question of, an individual's authority to say this part of the tradition we're committed to and this part we're not is where I get lost. And I think that that's actually some of the upside of denominations when they function properly and can articulate their values and principles, because they sort of set the tone for that. Whereas I think a hallmark of post-denominationalism is, dare I say it, Ish hayashar be'einav ya'aseh, the phrase that comes up over and over and over again from the Book of Judges, that like everybody sort of just like makes their own decision and does their own thing, and we're leaderless. And certainly in the Book of Judges, that's like not a good thing.
I thought you were trying to put me on the spot. Where's the part where you
so
put me
I'm
on the
saying,
spot?
like, how do you sorry, what I'm trying to say, but not.
It's good. It was fun. I'm waiting to be feeling the sweat.
How do you decide as an individual? Like, I don't know what your position is on cremation, but you gestured in that direction.
I'll tell you right now, I'm not for it. I'm not.
Okay. So I was making wrong assumptions, and
yeah. No.
Okay.
I still have my moments. Like I some people may think of it as a contradiction, but I've always felt like it's less about what I want and it's about what the people who are looking for want. But I have to be authentic and genuine in what I'm doing. I cannot do something that in my gut feels wrong. Right. So it's this balance for me. Like, you have to give the people you're preaching to, you have to understand what it is they want. They're driving you. If you're not going to be the rabbi for those people, they're going to find a different rabbi. But I also can't be uncomfortable with these sorts of things. So on intermarriage, I found a way that I was comfortable with it and I was okay. But with cremation, I've never been able to understand that. I've never been able to make that work within Jewish context. So that's why I say, like, I'm not conservative, I'm not reform, I'm not Reconstructionist, though I've always kind of liked the Reconstructionist angle, and I liked a lot of Mordechai Kaplan's thoughts. I just had to kind of carve out my own way because, as we've discussed already, maybe we'll get more into it, most people are, they're getting rid of their labels, their denominational labels. So it doesn't work anymore when you say to them, I'm a conservative rabbi. People don't know what that means. I'm a reform rabbi. People don't know what that means. You need to tell them I'm a rabbi who believes in X, Y, and Z. You've been living in the States for too long.
I'll just own that I made an assumption and I made it.
No, it's totally fine. But yeah, that's where I come out on that particular topic.
Let me ask you, Yedida, as somebody who has, Orthodoxy within their background, how do you see post-denominationalism functioning within the practice that you do personally, professionally? Where do you think that the things are going to be moving towards?
I arrived at JTS as a skirt-wearing, long-sleeve, turtleneck-wearing, modern Orthodox Jewish girl from Toronto who showed up to study academic Bible. So, like, there's sort of like an inherent tension in going to pursue a program at a conservative seminary graduate school where sort of the premise of the whole thing is that the Torah was not given to Moses at Sinai by God. So I'm full of contradictions. As an undergrad, the first time I sort of got my head around the documentary hypothesis, I found myself crying in one of my professor's office, and I'll, forever be indebted to him for, talking me down and telling me it was okay and I could still be a committed, observant Jew. And like, there are plenty of us who sort of live in this tension. And I think that's more and more true over the last 20 years. So I hope that Maharat will still let me graduate in a few weeks. So now that I'm on the record having said that, my years at JTS were, it was my mid to late 20s. And developmentally, it is my understanding that that's also when people stop seeing the world in black and white and start to see it in more gradations of gray. I went on a short American Jewish World Service trip to the middle of nowhere, Mexico. And that was sort of my first like deep exposure and encounter to people who were becoming rabbis in liberal denominations and, hearing and being in conversation with them about the values that were driving them to serve the Jewish people as rabbis. I never really thought about that, except that I had already decided that the rabbinic path was definitely not my direction because women weren't rabbis in Orthodoxy. That was just starting those years that I was in New York. And now I'm finishing this rabbinic program, but I think that the different denominations and denominational politics of Orthodoxy in America can't decide whether or not Yeshivat Maharat is inside the line or outside the line. So given that there's so much debate and that it's, in that in-between space, arguably one could say, nobody wants me to say this, but it's on the boundaries of Orthodoxy. It defines itself as Orthodox and others define it as outside Orthodoxy. And I don't have a stake in that.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
Let me take a few steps back because I want to make an argument for denominationalism.
Please.
I want to point out the fact that as long as there has been Jews, there has been denominations, right? We're in the desert. We're 12 tribes. Everybody has their own stake in what's going on and they differentiate themselves. You get to Israel, eventually, within a short amount of time, you have the kingdom of Israel and you have the kingdom of Judah, and they have their own thing and they don't like each other. You get to the second temple, you get the Pharisees, you get the Sadducees, you get the Essenes, you get all different sects. You get post that, you get people who live in different places, and then that becomes their defining feature because they end up with customs for hundreds of years that end up defining them. So you have Provence Jews, and you have German Ashkenazic Jews, and you have Sephardim, and you have Sephardim from the Maghreb, and you have Sephardim from actual Sepharad, and then you have Persian Jews who are neither, and you have Yemenite Jews who are none of the above, even though they get lumped into, Sephardic because they're not Ashkenazi, which is totally Ashkenormative. So we've all, and then if you get into Hasidic versus Misnagdic versus mystical versus, liberal, so there's always been that. And as long as you are this big tent of people, you're always going to have factions. The only thing that we are looking at when we say, oh, we're moving away from denominations is the fact that every other denomination other than Orthodoxy has failed at getting behind a social movement. There are no more conservatives, large C, capital C conservative Jews. I mean, they're there, but they're a minority of a minority. There are very few capital R Reform Jews, as we've been talking about, right? The movements have not been able to cultivate people and a social group behind their denominations. And so everything is sort of collapsing into each other, except for Orthodoxy, where Orthodoxy has their own subset of all of these things happening, but it's happening within Orthodoxy within we're Orthodox, but you're not Orthodox, but you are. And Orthodoxy is the one that's sort of realigning itself in its own way, but figuring out what that means in the context of other Jewry and Judaisms.
And Avi, I'll build on it. I actually think that this idea that no denominations is better, pump the brakes. I'm not saying Indeed is saying that, but I'm saying some people might be saying that. And I want to say, I think we're lost. I don't think labels are necessarily a bad thing. I was thinking about this. If you were going out, if you were looking for a place to eat dinner, you can't just go to a restaurant. You don't know what they serve. The labels they're gonna help you understand what it is.
I love that analogy.
It's going to help you understand what you're going to get, right? Am I going to a Greek restaurant, a Mexican restaurant? Well, now you're going to a fusion restaurant, but at least there's something that gives you an idea where you don't have to show up at the restaurant or look at the menu to find out if they're going to have any food you like. It used to be that you're looking for a shul. Okay, well, I know I want a conservative shul because I know that this is what a conservative shul is. And this is what a Reform shul is. This is what an Orthodox shul is. But that's changed because of what you've been talking about. The movements have been behind. They've been reactive, not proactive. They haven't stayed up with Jews as Jews have been changing what they're looking for. And so they're constantly chasing, and now they're out of touch, and they can't. Now the labels don't mean anything. We need to realign. We need denominations either that have new names, or at least because people need to know what it is, the kind of school or synagogue or camp that at least gives you an idea if it's close to your values, what you align with, as opposed to this is a synagogue, and then you have to ask every single synagogue, what do you think about intermarriage? What do you think about cremation? Do men and women sit together? Do you read the Torah on the annual cycle or the triennial cycle? And the labels used to give you those answers so you wouldn't have to ask those questions, and now they don't.
So I think that also it's not just about the shuls, right? I think we've raised this, that it's about the summer camp infrastructure and the after school infrastructure and the Sunday school, and choosing your kid's school is like, sure, it's like partly about the content and curriculum, but it's also about choosing the way that you want your kid to be socialized, the environment in which you want your kid to be most comfortable, right? Like, do you want to send your kid to a liberal or pluralistic school? Or do you want to send your kid to an Orthodox school so they're comfortable in that Orthodox milieu and they learn how to pray like an Orthodox Jew and, you know, the balance of the curricula. And I think that that's also like a really helpful way of thinking about these choices, like which environment speaks to you and as is your comfort zone. And also in thinking about like what you're giving over to the next generation, cultural, social zone do you want them to be most comfortable in? Anyway, I thought that was compelling.
There's something about Orthodoxy, I think, which is very instructive. I always used to joke that there was two types of modern Orthodox Jews, right? There's the modern Orthodox Jew that really believes in like, you know, lishma, like want to be modern and Orthodox. We believe in academia. We believe in going to the symphony. This is part of our Judaism. This is what we do. And then there's modern Orthodox Jews that basically believe that the Haredim are right, but I'm weak. Like I like going to the concerts with my wife and her friends, and we like hanging out on Saturday night. I guess we're modern Orthodox. And they're not really, they just don't want to admit that they are more aligned with the Haredi world. But that, again, is social.
So I think that one of the ways I think about this is the percentage of your brain space, which is taken up with thinking about how to do things in a halachic framework. Like way over on, let's say, the right of the spectrum, people who get up and learn all day and like think about how they're supposed to properly put their shoes on and, you know, everything that they eat, everything that they see, all of the people that they come into contact with, everything that they read is, you know, Torah and within their bubble. Whereas on the more liberal side, where people have chosen to engage more with the modern world, I think in some ways, it's really easy to be on the far extremes of this, right? Like either you're totally 100% immersed, never come into contact with the modern world, or you're totally, totally, totally modern. And like finding that personal balance in between that, you know, either you're going to a concert because you're weak or you're going to a concert because you think it's okay to go to a concert and also keep one's, you know, religious commitments, whatever they are. I think that that's like a harder sometimes balance. And it actually like requires in some ways, I think like a lot of deeper thought, right? A lot more study, a lot more work, a lot more philosophizing. And I think, right, like this is the concern on the left wing of Orthodoxy, that it's the slippery slope. And I think, right, like the conservative movement's motto about tradition and change and the bush was not consumed, right? Like it's fighting with that balance. And we're talking now about movements failing. And the measure, I think, mostly for that failure, quote unquote failure for those listening, is that there are not as many Jews in the pews. But maybe it's not about numbers. Maybe it's about quality and people who are showing up, who are still really committed to one movement or another because they have done that research and they have made that philosophical commitment that they are ideologically Reformed Jews. So I just think that like there's so many different ways of framing the problem that it's more or less of a problem. And I also think that there is some utility to denominations, right? Like a lot of the reading that we did for today talked about what the infrastructure of the denominations offers to the synagogues and offers to the people. And I think that that's historically been true. And there are like problems with that model. But I also think that this post-denominational structure can't exist without the old brick and mortar. There does still seem to be some utility in, you know, denominations, at least in as a way of, you know, knowing which restaurant you're going to.
I like the way that you framed it as commandedness. Once you bracket the Haredi world, because they're an outlier in terms of how you think about commandedness, you're going to end up really seeing two broad categories within Judaism now, which is people who feel commanded, which is modern to liberal Orthodox to the Hadar world, which is picking up a lot of those people, to the people in the conservative movement that do have a sense of like some sort of commandedness, however we define that. And then you're going to have the people that don't feel commanded, and yet we do all of these things. And then there's going to be a spectrum within there. And that's going to be the major shift and the major split in the future of denominations is to say, well, how do you define commandedness and how do you define non-commandedness, and what falls under that rubric?
So I have long thought that all of us in modernity, after the kahila structure that had some power over you falls apart, anybody who understands themselves to be commanded is choosing to understand themselves as being commanded. It's not compulsory anymore. I think it's a real choice. And, and maybe that's part of the equation.
That's a tricky thing when the definition of a mitzvah is a commandment. And as I tell bar mitzvah students and bat mitzvah students, do you ever think of yourself being commanded by anyone in your life, even your parents? No. I mean, this is bigger than anything. And that was the whole idea. This is from God. So if the whole idea is 613 mitzvot, 613 commandments, if you become a son and daughter of the commandments, how do we work it when commandedness is a choice? Those seem to be at odds with each other. I'm not disagreeing. I'm fascinated by it.
If you were writing the sci-fi novel, right, predicting the future of Judaism, how do you think this realignment plays itself out in 50 or 100 years? Meaning, what are the established organizations? What is the big communal structure? What's working and what's not, and what's being left behind from today to 100 years from now?
I think we're all on Mars. I don't know.
Mars? I didn't even want to go to that tall mountain to do a minyan. I'm not going to Mars to do a minyan. I think that it's not enough to just say there will be some people say we're going Orthodox or non-Orthodox. I don't think that works. I think that the directions we're headed, that conservative movement is in the most trouble. And I think that there's going to be a redefining, probably led by the people, and that new movements will emerge, new denominations will emerge. But I think that we're going to still have people need, as much as they might be eschewing them, people need labels. People like labels. People like knowing where they're going. They like being able, maybe you won't find people on the street who say, I am a conservative Jew because I go to a conservative synagogue and my kids go to a conservative camp, but maybe there will be a new label in there. I think that we're still going to have labels. They are just, we're changing them right now. And I think that there is a huge disconnect between the leadership and the people, regardless of the movements, need to kind of start listening to the people again. The people will direct this. That's the only thing I know for sure, is that the people will kind of steer us.
I agree. And I think that this is one of the first times in history that things are going to be more bottom up than top down.
Good way to put it.
I think that synagogues, shul life is going to become orthodoxy, right? Orthodoxy will still have the shul as one of its central governing spaces, and non-orthodoxy will really move away from synagogue life. People are getting married.
I was going to say, bar mitzvahs?
You know, and I know that people are getting married outside of shul much more than they are getting married inside of shul.
It drives my life, my career.
Exactly. People are getting buried, right, outside of shul life rather than in. People are starting to have bar mitzvahs. People are starting to realize, you know what? I can find the right rabbi who will bring a Torah to my country home, and we're going to have our bar mitzvah there, and I don't need to have a synagogue. So that is where the alignment is happening. Is if you want to be in a synagogue and feel like that's the traditional thing, you're moving in an Orthodox direction. The rest is going to be bottom up, and you're going to start finding it's going to actually feel paradoxically more traditional, more 19th century, more 18th century, where you find a rabbi who sort of associates with the values that you align yourself with, and you will always have that person for your life cycle events, for your learning, for your doing stuff in the non-Orthodox world. And the big structures are, I think, going to move away from denominations. I think they're even going to move away from the federation model, because I think the federation model is on the verge of collapsing as well. But that's a whole different discussion. Let's save that for 5 episodes in the future. Yeah, meaning 5 whole episodes, not 5 weeks from now.
I see so much of what you're talking about, and then I wonder if the pendulum will swing back and a lot of those independent rabbis will start working together because they find that there's an advantage in that. I'm just curious, because that do a bunch of rabbis doing what I do, does that long-term help the community or long-term hurt the community if everybody's just doing their own thing, like Yedida was talking about earlier in our chat?
I don't know the answer for that.
At least we're smart enough to admit we don't know.
The only like certainty about Judaism is that it is constantly changing and in flux and remaking itself. So, you know, for all of the hand wringing about the end of denominations, or maybe not hand wringing about it, you know, we are observing the moment that we are in, and where we've come from, and we're, you know, we think we know maybe where we're going, but only time really will tell.
Let's move on to our wisdom of the week. Some questions, some idea from the weekly portion. Matthew, I think you are going to inaugurate the first non-Avi Torah for Not in Heaven.
I'm going to attempt. Okay, so this week's Parsha is a good old double Parsha. We had one of those a couple weeks ago, right, with Tazria Mitzorah. This week we've got Bahar Bechukotai, and the end of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, Chazak, Chazak, V'nid Chazek. Bahar Bechukotai, as a former weekly Torah reader, was a scary parsha because there is an aliyah in Bechukotai that is a very, very long one. It's one of these sections of the Torah, they call it the Tochacha, right? Like a big rebuke, a whole list of curses, and you can't stop laning it in the middle because you can't end on this kind of negative note. And God kind of says, if you follow all the commandments, lots of blessings. Blessings for the land, blessings for you. It'll be just blessings. Follow the laws, blessings. But if you don't follow the laws, curses. And the blessings get like 5% of the parsha, and the curses get 95% of the parsha. And this always struck me as such an old school way of teaching, of parenting, of sermonizing, that if you chastise the congregation and scare them and threaten them, don't do this, or that will work somehow better than saying, if you do this, good things will happen to you. So my question to the two of you and to myself, and I guess our audience playing along at home, can you think of something in your life that has motivated you? Were you more motivated by the promise of a blessing, or were you more motivated by the threat of a curse, whether it was from your parents or your teachers or your rabbis or whoever? And what was more effective?
Definitely. I mean, I think all the psychology tells you that the carrot is way more effective than the stick. I definitely I think I learned that the hard way one summer, the first time I was a summer camp counselor. And I was like, I was just like, my inclination was to be ridiculously strict, and that backfired. It was terrible. But I don't know. I try to get myself out of bed really early in the morning. I read something on the internet, which I read too much, that talked about how nobody likes to run, right? Nobody wants to go running. I don't run. But that it's more about liking the feeling of the accomplishment and getting the thing done as a motivating factor. So, you know, there's some wisdom. It's not so much about the stick, but for me, there's, you know, I definitely respond to a carrot.
You know, I was listening to what you're saying, and I'm like, you know why there's only 5 verses for the blessings and all of these curses? Because it's very easy to be an optimist, right? It just takes that much, right? A little 5 verses to be an optimist. There's so many ways to be pessimistic. There's always something that's going to go wrong. So it's so much more, you need so much elaboration as to why you're a pessimist, as to why this isn't going to work. And I'm with you, Yedida, and I know that's often the good feeling is the thing that should be the thing that motivates you. But for example, when I'm writing or when I'm doing something, you know, that is more editorial or ideas based, there is nothing like a deadline to get you and get your writing into shape. And that is the ultimate stick. That is not the carrot, because you don't it's the dread of missing your deadline, which is the thing that gets you going. And it's not, oh, wow, I'm going to get this piece done 3 weeks early and my editor is going to be super happy with me. It has nothing to do with that. It is always the stick for me. It is always that I don't want this bad thing to happen, and therefore that's why I'm going to do the good thing.
Totally. I'm a lifelong procrastinator, and, you know, working on the radio for all those years and everything, the deadline that gives you the motivation, the fear. I for some reason, I keep going back to this image that I think so many people can relate to. My sister and me in the back of the car, my parents in the front of the car. We're on some kind of family road trip. This is back before the days of GPS. So my parents are inevitably arguing about the fact that they're lost and they don't know which way to go. And my sister and I are causing trouble from the back, and my one of my parents says something like, if you two don't cut this out, we're going to turn this car right around right now.
And you were like, please, yeah.
Yeah, and no one ever turned the car around. So it's just like, I mean, you want people to do it. Yeah, maybe the deadline works, but yeah, I don't know. No one ever turned the car around.
Thank you for listening to Not in Heaven this week. Our producer and editor is Zachary Kaufman. Michael Freeman is the executive producer. To catch every episode, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to support our show, consider making a donation to the CJN at thecjn.ca/donate.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.